welcome to another Songs for Change podcast. We are going live, and today with me I have Ismael Paez Civico. Hello, Ismael. Thank you very much for joining. We are going to talk about human dignity a bit today, but first of all, Ismael, would you like to present yourself shortly a bit to us?
Sure. Thank you very much, Marija, again for the invitation. I hope you can hear me well. So let's see. So I'm Ismael Paez Civico. I've been involved mostly in society organizations and NGOs for the past decade-ish, 8, 9, 10 years maybe, in all different kinds of organizations. I started as a volunteer in Scouts, then been in student organizations, then I started working for an international youth organization, and now I'm the executive director of the Confederation of European Senior Expert Services, and I'm also a board member at the European Youth Forum. I'm also part of, currently part of one committee in the European Commission on migration, specifically on communication, and I'm also part of an advisory board, youth advisory board for EU, UK youth engagement, and different bits and pieces here and there, mainly involved around civil society, youth engagement, volunteering a lot also. A bit very general.
Different pieces, but all around and everywhere. That's really
pretty
nice.
much.
Yeah, but just to be clear, you are here today as on your personal level. So yeah, just to note that. Well, I'm just gonna start bombing you with the questions, and we're gonna dig into the topic a bit. So the first question I would like to ask you is, in your opinion, what do you think? How do cultural differences shape perceptions of human rights? So, and to what extent should universal human rights standards accommodate the cultural diversity? It's a hard question, but I'm gonna let you get into it.
I mean, I think we need to understand first where human rights came from, essentially, or at least the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I mean, the concept of human rights has been developed before. Some ideas, some humanist ideas, some philosophers or legal philosophers, let me put it that way, also spoke a lot on religious grounds, or even actually on just Enlightenment grounds on the 18th and 19th centuries. So it has been something being developed bit by bit. Now, when it comes to the actual Universal Declaration of Human Rights of the UN in 1948, I believe, it was actually a transcultural, transcontinental, transnational agreement that this was needed after the atrocities of the Second World War, and that all people were not treated equally, like we saw what happened with Nazi Germany and the Jews, or people from minorities, Roma, sexual minorities, etc. So the least that was agreed upon. Now, again, it's not a treaty, so it can't really be executed on national level, but it does leave some fundamentals that overall everyone has agreed to them. Now, of course, there's a lot of, how would I put this? I wouldn't say leeway necessarily for the interpretation of the text, or at least the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but there is lots of different ways that other countries work on or interpret specific terminologies, like what does slavery mean, what is actually torture, and again, you can get into really big definitions in each one of these words. But of course, we know human rights are not respected on a global level, even though it is a UN convention, declaration, which is not a treaty, so it's not applicable. So I do think there's a common ground among all cultures. Now, generally, I don't see a supranational body globally applying and being the executive branch of this, mainly for geopolitical reasons all around the world. So yeah, I mean, again, there are similarities, whether it comes from Christian theology, Muslim theology, Jewish theology, when taken really on a global scale, or even in political theology. I think there is a common understanding on human rights. Now, how it literally gets applied, that is quite different, and especially because of the lack of an executive body, really. I hope that answers your question a bit, or maybe you can ask a sub question, and then I can maybe get more into the nitty gritty.
Oh, it's okay. I also agree on that. I think it's very there is a universal understanding of what human rights. I think the implementation in different cultures, and yeah, because the world is so different, and everybody has like this tiny, I would say, differences
Hmm.
in what is basic human right for their culture and for them. So I think that's where
Hmm.
we can still strive to have a universal understanding and to implement it on a universal level. Maybe someday in the future, I would say, when all these differences between people stop dividing people. I would say that.
Hmm. Yeah.
All right. I'm gonna go for the second question. It's, I think, one of the well, it's the actual one, and we've been encountering this much lately. So, what do you think? In what ways does do advancements in the technology, such as surveillances, which we see all around the cities and so
Hmm.
on, and social media monitoring, and how do these impact the protection, or how do they violate the individual human rights?
Okay. I'm actually going to go back and add something quite important that to be added. Even though the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not necessarily legally binding, it has inspired a lot of different texts and legally binding texts all around the world. For instance, the European Convention on Human Rights is one of them. Then you can go back to the UK with their own constitution and their own very rigid human rights texts and in jurisprudence. And then it goes to the US and different parts around the world. So even though this text is not legally binding, it has inspired a lot of different texts from all around the world to have more rigid legal frameworks, really, for the protection of these rights. Now, when it comes to technology, I think I'm going to answer that in both in two ways. The question around technology and human rights. I think we are right now going through a technological revolution because most of our realities are really online. So if we were speaking about to be respected in quote unquote real life, in person life, and most now there's a parallel universe which is online. Of course, that also needs to be respected in the online sphere, especially because, again, things like torture, there are some very dark parts of the web that can be displayed on there. So directly that incites people to create that kind of content, because if there's a demand, there will be a supply, right? So it does offer more opportunities for people that want to violate these kind of human rights. Now, tech has also allowed to shed light on different issues around the world. So usually, if you want to change on national level, from a legal perspective, at least a political change, wherever the country, it has to come from within. It has to come from the own people, and the access to internet or the availability that technology has given to the people around the world, that has helped a lot of different movements around the world
Yeah.
for the respect of human rights for their own countries. Now, of course, there are going to be areas online where, again, because my view on this is quite, I don't want to be as restrictive as possible, because I personally don't want to block innovation either. And I think this is the main debate between Europe, for instance, and the United States. The United States doesn't have big barriers for innovation, but then again, it has lots of other problems when it comes to blocking specific kind of content in the online sphere, which the EU does not have. The EU is becoming more and more rigid with this, with the Digital Services Act, for instance, and now the AI Act. They want to regulate as much as possible to preserve the rights of the citizens, which is completely legitimate. But this is one of the main differences you get between different kind of continents and really philosophies, cultural philosophies and political philosophies between the European Union and like the United States or even China, which will be the big three. Well, I mean, also India, but I would keep those big three as the main drivers of innovation, regulation, and just general production of these services and online spheres. So, yeah, of course, people can be, as human rights per se, violated on the online sphere. No, but it is a tool highly used to push those violations. So
Yeah, I think that the main debate today in the online sphere is what is, I would say, the level, where is the border between discrimination and the border with the right to for free speech and so on. And yeah, we see a lot of content that's been shut
Hmm.
down, censored, and so on. So one would say this is my right for to speak, and then
Hmm.
others will be easily offended by what the other person said. I think yeah, the online sphere is what now I see that on let's say I would say the most people get on personal level regarding
Yeah,
that.
if I may comment on that, actually on hate speech, there's a very very different understandings, philosophically, politically, and culturally between what free speech actually means, right? In general English common law, in the sense that you shouldn't. There hasn't been viewed much. Now it's happening a little bit in Canada, really, and in the UK, but United States not really. Is that they are what I would call, or what is called, free speech absolutists or fundamentalists, I think. Anyway, so essentially it means that you can say whatever you want without hurting, if it hurts them, and nobody cares, and that is your human right, right? What right supersedes which right? The right of protection or the right of freedom to offend someone? Because at the end of the day, it's not a physical violent act. So there's a very, very different understanding of what free speech means in Europe and what it means in the Anglophone sphere, United States mainly. UK also, there's a different kind of a connotation. But even the UK is quite similar to the European view. They say there is free speech, but there is a line that not to cross, which is incitation to violence. So that is a line essentially for historical reasons, I would say, because of the rise of fascism and far right ideologies mainly that called for the eradication of specific marginalized groups. And I think that's where we had to draw the line between what actually means free speech and where does that stop. So which right supersedes which? And I would agree with that proposal. Really, everything that crosses incitation to violence, incitement, sorry, not incitation, incitement of violence would be a line not crossing, because it does attack the rights, let's say, of those specific minorities that you're attacking for, to live in a safe space, really, physically, a physical safe space in this case, not necessarily psychological. But so yeah, and again, the online sphere can very much feed this need of hate speech, of discrimination against marginalized communities. I can again just imagine if there was internet back in the 30s in Germany. It would have gone maybe a lot quicker. It would have spread a lot more around the world, maybe, or maybe it would have gotten shut down. I don't think there's much point on speculating really to what would have happened. But again, it could have gone either way. So of course, it just has to be some sort of regulation and follow up on what happens online, really.
Let's follow up on that, on the regulations and this online sphere and censoring. We see a lot of this well, I would say problems happening with the Meta and COVID-19 pandemic, which was actually my next question is, so regarding the pandemic and the censoring, and in line with that, what do you think were the rights, the human rights that were most violated during that? I mean, we can all agree there was a lot, I would say, but that, yeah.
I mean, that will put me a bit in a pickle. I mean, I will answer honestly from at least
if you don't feel like answering, it's
no. I mean, on a personal level, I can answer again, and I'm not speaking for anyone but myself on this. Now, the pandemic was interesting because it was never seen, at least to that extent, in our time, right? And nobody actually knew what was going on with COVID. Nobody knew. It was very scary. You could see people getting very, very quickly infected, especially those with already predispositions to getting sick, people with diabetes, for instance, people with asthma, old people, again, seniors that their health weren't really great, right? So we saw a pattern that people were dying, and there was something to be happen. There was something happening, and nobody exactly knew what was going on. So to that extent, I think that some draconian measures would have some justification if you were to put it in front of a court of human rights. So the draconian measures taken when it comes to complete lockdowns, which again, we don't speak enough about what that did to mental health of like young people that were, it did a lot. Like suicide rates and depression rates, they rose so much because we are humans, we are social beings, and then one day out of the blue, you're locked in your house, no access to nothing. If you don't have a terrace, like, you get very, very little fresh air. You couldn't even go for the run. There was some countries in Europe, in the EU, again, I mean, we're not even talking about China at this point. Like, China was a lot more strict. But in Europe, you couldn't go out for a run. You would get tackled by police. In countries like Italy or for Spain, people were getting dogs just for the sake of being able to go out. And even in some instances, I think you could even take out your dog. I mean, I can't remember, but every country had their own thing. There were different waves, right? So, of course, human rights were violated to some extent during COVID. Now, to what point that was justified, in my personal opinion, I think at the beginning it could have been justified. Because again, you have to make a balance between what was more important, the freedom of movement of the people or the freedom of life of the people that were vulnerable to this virus. What we found out bit later on, bit by bit, and this is where maybe I have a problem with the censoring that happened online, is that information was coming out about what exactly was the virus and who it affected more. So quite soon after, 6 months, maybe a year after it started, so by the end of 2020 or beginning of 2021, we knew that young, healthy people were not as affected by COVID as the elderly or people with predetermined pathologies or issues or health issues. And there, the checks and balances, the pros and cons didn't work out for me. I don't see any justification of keeping young people locked up.
Yeah.
When at the end of the day, is that better than them falling into complete depression? What are the rights of those young people, right? So again, everything is a trade-off. You never get anything for free, and you're always going to have to give up something. At the beginning, I believe it was justified, and no one knew what was going on. And then I think that bit by bit, governments just didn't know what to do, and I think lots of them doubled down because they knew that they made mistakes. And I think that most governments, what they did, instead of saying, "I made a mistake, I'm sorry," it's human. I mean, again, governments and people in decision makers, put it that way, presidents, prime ministers, members of parliament, what have you, they are still human. They're not these super people. They will make mistakes, but what the bigger mistake that they made was not admitting that they made that mistake, and it just doubled down, most of them, and they said, "No, we were right. We will not answer for these things that we've done." So that was mainly my problem. People not accessing education, which again, education is again human right to that extent, and not being able to go to church and practice your faith, again, the freedom of religion is also human right. So it really down to what you're willing to give up for what, at least for the COVID question. And then the censoring online, it happened that people were being censored because new information was arising. And it is true, of course, that there were fake news.
There was a lot of misinformation coming from everywhere. People didn't know what to believe or who to believe.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, even today, you don't even reading back. I mean, it happens to me. It says, "Oh, this happened." Sorry.
Yeah, everybody. No, sorry, I interrupted you. I think everybody was happy at the end that it finally, let's say, it finished, and nobody wants to look back and do a proper analysis and give some conclusions, or also go for what's been done wrong. And I don't know, but for me, I think what was the biggest discussion among the people was the vaccination, because it was offered as a free choice when it wasn't. I would say it wasn't, because if you didn't do it, you were not able to live properly. So I think that was for me, that was and it was supposed to, it was presented like, you are doing it voluntarily, so if something bad happens, nobody's gonna be responsible for the consequences that, let's say, the vaccine can do to your body, and so on and so on. So it was, for me, I think that was the biggest
I mean, I'm not a doctor. I'm not what would you call, a virologist or whatever. I mean, I'm not in that kind. But from the information I gathered, the main justification at the beginning was to protect the people that are most vulnerable. So the whole sales pitch at the beginning to get the vaccine, which again, it was demanded by lots of employers also. I mean, I remember I mostly had to take it, one, because I was going to visit my grandparents, and they are vulnerable people. So it was sold as you take the vaccine, you will not be able to transmit it. You will not transmit COVID anymore because you're protected, right? Which, well, unfortunately, 8 months later, that was debunked. Yeah. That was debunked. You could get vaccinated, still have COVID, and still spread it on. But regardless, so again, I would understand if at the time that is really what we believe. So I would understand that that justification. Now, that said, what trade-off were you willing to do? People were not willing to get vaccinated and getting fired, for instance, from their jobs. Again, I don't have the answer. I just know what the problem was, and people didn't see the pros and cons.
Nobody has the answers, and it was a complicated matter, and it was handled in the way it was handled. And we just hope that if God forsake that something like this happens again, I think it will be, the resilience would be much better, and people will be more prepared, and the ones in charge would be able to answer these better.
But I mean, I think now most national governments have crisis management strategies now in place for when this happens. So it has been a learning curve. Again, back to human rights, they came mainly because of the bigger mistakes of the Second World War. So you always learn, and unfortunately, we haven't seen to that extent that kind of thing again within the European Union after its founding and everything. So I think for the COVID pandemic and future ones, it will probably be the same. Countries will have learned from their past mistakes. They're going to do what they did right, and then hopefully they're not going to do what they did wrong. And again, but we can't forget what happened, because again, we're just going to repeat it. So
we're gonna stay in this crisis management and let's say government's response. And I'm gonna ask you my last question. It's also like, do you know how does the EU addresses human rights challenges which are posed by the migration and asylum policies, particularly concerning the rights of refugees and migrants at its borders?
Yeah. Okay. So this is another question. There were big. So you can speak about, not necessarily that, like the legal text says, the right of freedom of movement, that any person is free to move, but that does not supersede national legislation, right? So that does not mean you can just cross the border. There again, there's a legal hierarchy here, and usually constitutions and are above that from a convention that again is not ratified and is not legally binding by the country. So the countries can decide who comes in their country or not. Now, from a purely humanist and philosophical perspective, I think there needs to be a differentiation between what is refugees and what is economic migrants, or sometimes they get very much mixed, because you can be an economic migrant and a refugee. What I mean by this, that you can be to a point of extreme poverty, that in my eyes, at least, that would be considered as a refugee. My main concern with the EU, in whichever direction is going to go, that the people that are going to end up losing are the refugees themselves, right? The big wars that were also like just less than a decade ago, Syria, or even going on now still, now with Palestine, for instance, Syria, Yemen, lots of wars again. We forget about ongoing wars in Africa with some militias hunting down, religious wars, Christians being hunted down in Sudan. Again, there are wars all over, but I think what the EU needs to have is a very rigid, necessarily when it comes to human rights, a rigid and well done immigration system for refugees, for people that are really in danger of their lives, and have an easier legal migration system for economic migrants. Because see, the problem was, one of the main problems from coming to Africa into Europe, it's not necessarily, I mean, of course, papers and everything, but it is extremely expensive. And for most migrants coming from very disadvantaged backgrounds or very poor villages in some parts of Africa, I mean, in my experience, I could say West Africa or Senegal or things of the sort, is that it's a lot cheaper to pay a smuggler than to go into Europe legally, because they're going to ask for bank checks. They're going to ask that you have 90 euros minimum per day for 3 months, I believe. So there's a lot of money you need to save up, and they need to see income and so income coming in your bank account and you making transactions, so the money is fluid. There are lots of checks, and unfortunately for most people, when they want to look for a better life, or they do want to seek refuge from XYZ, again with lots of LGBT refugees from Africa, also people that are being chased on a private level, but they don't but they're not considered as refugees because in their countries, being gay is not criminalized, for instance. So if you're part of the LGBT community and your country does not criminalize being gay or LGBT or whatever, you will not get right to asylum, and that's a problem because most of these persecutions happen in the private sphere. And again, there is a legal loophole in there that does not help most of the people that really need to seek refuge in Europe. So Europe has to do lots of things. I'm not necessarily sure we're going on the right direction because, again, of course, if people are crossing the Mediterranean and they are drowning, we have, regardless of legal perspective, a moral duty to help a person that is drowning. But what we need to make sure is that the people that come in aren't taking boats. People that make sure that people that come in through safer routes, so that it's cutting down from the people smugglers, taking them out of business. So what I would think is to have cheaper ways of accessing Europe through maybe some other kind of background checks, not necessarily financial background checks, because last time I checked, finances does not mean the capacity or the morality or the worth of a person, which in the end of the day is what's being used as a standard to come into Europe legally, is the amount of money that you have. And again, putting a very clear standard of what we consider a refugee. And I think also to some extent, I'm not saying that all the time they don't get access if it's only in the private sphere they're getting persecuted and not on the national one, but just make it way more complicated for you to get asylum, to seek asylum, if your country does not criminalize something specific, or like your sexuality, for instance, if we're speaking about LGBT rights. So yeah,
this is a good point because we see a lot in the news these unfortunate situations that happen, and then with the smugglers, they're just taking advantage of situation, and there it evolves in the human trafficking, and it just expands from bad to worse, I would say. Enabling.
Yeah, exactly. And you can't blame it on the people.
Yeah,
it's like, I mean, we're very lucky we haven't had the most recent waves of refugee. I mean, of course, the most recent waves of European, quote unquote, continental European refugees was now Ukraine. But 20 years ago, we had it in the Balkans also. But for geographical reasons and for political reasons, etc., it was a lot easier. Like now, for political reasons, for Ukraine refugee has been a lot easier to come into Europe. From a moral perspective, and if we believe in equality, it should be the same easy as a Ukrainian, as a Palestinian, or as a Syrian, or as a Yemeni, or as a Sudanese again. But geopolitics is still a thing. Politics is still a thing, and politicians make hard choices and hard decisions where we can't always comprehend them, and we shouldn't always agree with them. But we need to understand where they're coming from at least, and understand those perspectives. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, unfortunately, what I'm seeing now, that the people that really end up losing are refugees themselves. That do not get the good, not the treatment, but they don't have the relevant ways to get into Europe safely. Because again, most of the time you can only seek refuge as seek asylum in Europe is getting into the continent. So you can't request most of the time asylum being outside of Europe. So that's already a big flaw in the system.
Yeah.
So you can tell someone, oh yeah, you need to enter illegally and then seek asylum. But how do you enter legally then if you can't seek asylum from outside of Europe?
Yeah.
So yeah, it's not easy. They're not easy questions, but that's why I think like mentions and agreements among countries is the most important way. Like speaking with Libya, speaking with Morocco, speaking with Algeria, not as much, but mainly I would say, like, at least when it comes to Mediterranean neighboring countries and having these international agreements. And that's why texts like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights can help at least to inspire these countries for something else. But again, the change has to come from within. It shouldn't be Europe at least demanding this kind of change from those countries. The people themselves need to do this.
And we hope it will be done. Well, at least, I mean, the perfect scenario would be if these situations don't even come. Like, people don't end up in this situation. Start.
No, ideally, but yeah, I mean, if we know a little bit about history, that's unfortunately the curse of humankind. We're always going to be in conflict. There's always going to be poverty and wars and everything, which hopefully it doesn't happen, and it's happening less and less. I would say again, Europe was always in war. It's the first time we're in the EU. I mean, we know about Ukraine, but I think everyone understands this. What I mean by that, within the EU, there hasn't been a war in like 80 years now. within the confines of the European Union. And before, countries in the EU that are now in the EU were at war every other day. So there are ways to safeguard all of these things, and human rights as a general philosophy can help a lot, especially on a global scale. But it really has to come from within, and has to be the people themselves wanting that change.
Yeah. Well, I hope that someday the world will be able to live in, utopia, like in Star Trek's.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Well, thank you, Ismael, for your insights. I know it's a tricky topic and tricky question, so thank you for providing.
No, thank you for the invitation.
Thoughts and with us. So I don't know if there is any final word, quote, inspiring thing that you want to say, or not inspiring, anything.
Not necessarily. I mean, I think the question of human rights is very legitimate, and I think on a very general scale, most people agree on them. I think on a global level. I mean, even if we see whatever we see from specific governments or people, if you go to speak with the actual people, they would believe in human rights. They would believe on equality, on dignity, on right to a fair trial. But again, sometimes we can forget these, like the presumption of innocence also. And these kind of concepts. So I think the world is not that grim. People really do understand them, even if they don't know that it comes from human rights itself. Because again, we did not reinvent the wheel. The human rights was just a collage of different principles and cultures from different parts from around the world. That at the end of the day, UN member states managed to agree on it at least. But again, not legally binding. So maybe one day will be legally binding, hopefully. But then that's a whole discussion to have, what kind of power you want to give to the United Nations. So, but at the end of the day, still from a philosophical perspective, it's a good start.
It's a good start, and we'll see how maybe we won't see, but maybe the future will be better, and for everyone to and everyone will be able to live safely and well, I would say.
Hopefully. Yeah.
Thank you, Ismael. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank you,
Marija. And we will leave this hard topic behind. We will go with the positive thoughts for the future. And thank you once again. And I would say, if you have a chance to do something positive in somebody's life, do it. Small steps lead to big things. So thank you, Ismael. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Marija. It's a nice evening. Thank you.